Shakespeare's family were recusants. His mother's family, the Ardens, were from one of the most defiant, recusant families, one of the most devout Catholic families. Some of Shakespeare's cousins were executed for their part in illegal Catholic activities. Shakespeare's father was fined for his recusancy in 1592, by which time Shakespeare is writing his plays. Earlier than that, he resigns from his role in politics in Stratford-upon-Avon when it becomes necessary for politicians, local government officials to take an oath of supremacy whereby they would accept the king as the supreme head of the church. John Shakespeare, evidently in conscience, did not feel able to do that, so he resigned from any active role in politics rather than to compromise his conscience. Shakespeare himself had to leave Stratford-upon-Avon in a hurry due to his offending the local lord of the manor. We don't know exactly what he did to offend him. Some say he wrote a sonnet attacking him. Others say he poached and the land, the Lord of the Manor's lands. The fact is, we don't know. What we do know is the Lord of the Manor was very, very anti-Catholic, who took a great joy and satisfaction in overseeing the raids on Catholic homes in Stratford-upon-Avon amongst the recusant families, possibly Shakespeare's own family. Certainly we know of raids on houses of Shakespeare's friends. So he leaves in a hurry. Eventually he arrives in London, and the evidence such it is in London of his life also suggests he remained a defiant Catholic. The Earl of Southampton, his patron, was a recusant Catholic who had the Jesuit martyr St. Robert Southwell as his personal confessor. Shakespeare clearly moved in recusant circles. His poem, The Phoenix and the Turtle, seems to allude to another recusant couple, Roger and Anne Lyne. Anne Lyne would be martyred for harbouring Catholic priests in 1600, around the time Shakespeare writes his very angry play Hamlet. But perhaps the best evidence for Shakespeare's recusancy in the early times, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth, is when he is he ends up being charged with threatening the lives of two people, and he's bound over to keep the peace. What's interesting is the people who Shakespeare clearly had as enemies were known priest hunters who gloated about their raids on Catholic homes, about bringing out crucifixes and Catholic books and Catholic pictures and burning them outside the houses in a bonfire. So these are Shakespeare's enemies. His co-defendants, because there were people also charged with him, included known recusant Catholics. So Shakespeare's friends are recusant Catholics. His enemies are those who persecute the Catholics. But the best evidence biographically for Shakespeare's Catholicism comes from the last thing that he did before leaving London to retire and return to his family in Stratford-upon-Avon. This was the purchasing of the Blackfriars Gatehouse in about 1611 or 1612. So what's the Blackfriars Gatehouse? Well, as its name would suggest, it was the gatehouse to Blackfriars. Blackfriars were the Dominicans. So it was the entrance house to the Blackfriars religious community in London. And if you go to London, the area where that Dominican religious house is still called Blackfriars. There's a Blackfriars Bridge, there's a Blackfriars Tube Station, there's a Blackfriars area of London. So Shakespeare buys a Blackfriars Gatehouse. Now this is 80 years after the almost 75 years after the dissolution of the monasteries. So it certainly hasn't belonged to the Dominicans for decades. But we know from the property deeds that this house remained in resolute Catholic hands from the time of the dissolution of the monastery 75 years earlier to the time that Shakespeare buys it. We also know that the home is used as a base for secret Catholic activities. The house is raided on several occasions, and there are secret passageways leading down to the River Thames. The house is on the Thames, by which priests that are hiding there can escape by the secret passage and then onto a boat, etc. We know of Jesuit priests on the run from the authorities who seek refuge there. So this was a centre for Catholic activity. This is the house that Shakespeare purchases. Certainly didn't purchase it to live in, because as we've said, he purchased it just before leaving London. And nor did he purchase it merely as an investment, because he'd been a wealthy man for a long while. He bought the second largest house in Stratford-upon-Avon for his own family 12 or so years earlier. So he certainly could afford to buy houses earlier, but he had lived at this time in London for 25 years without ever purchasing a property to live in. There might be various reasons for that, which we don't have time to discuss. But he clearly purchased it so it could continue to be used in the same manner it had been used. And this is clear from the fact that he stipulates upon purchasing it that the current tenant should remain. And that tenant's name is John Robinson. John Robinson is clearly a friend of Shakespeare's. He's the only one of Shakespeare's London friends who's present during Shakespeare's final illness and signs his will. In the very year in which Shakespeare purchased the Blackfriars Gatehouse, John Robinson's brother enters the English College in Rome to study for the priesthood. So the final evidence is the fact that perhaps that the executress of Shakespeare's will is his daughter Susanna, who had herself been fined for her Catholic recusancy in 1606. And many of the beneficiaries of Shakespeare's will are local Catholics. So that's at least some of the biographical and historical evidence. If you want to dig and delve deeper, I invite you to read my book, The Quest for Shakespeare, The Bard of Avon and the Church of Rome, which gives the biographical and textual evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism.